In the late 1980s and early 1990s, a serial rapist and murderer is on the loose. On the suburban streets of Toronto, the rapist soon takes a partner. Together they kidnap and assault and murder as a couple. It truly was the worst case scenario of two personalities coming together and creating death and devastation in their wake. Their victims of choice are innocent young women and girls. Meet Paul Bernardo and his lover, Carla Homolka, aka Ken and Barbie, the schoolgirl killers. This program contains graphic, violence and sexual situations some viewers may find disturbing. Viewers' discretion is advised. This case starts right here in the Great White North of Canada, home to the free, home to the cold. Paul Kenneth Bernardo was born in Scarborough on the 27th of August in the year of 1964. He was the third and youngest born to Kenneth Walter and Marilyn Elizabeth Bernardo. Paul had two older siblings, Deborah and David Bernardo. And from the outside looking in, the family seemed to be a very much together, close and happy little unit. An everyday run-of-the-mill happy and normal family. However, behind closed doors, this family was everything but happy. Paul Bernardo's father, Kenneth, was a sick and violent excuse of a man and parent. An aggressive man who enjoyed nothing better than beating up his own wife, Marilyn, leaving severe bruises and injuries to her body on a regular basis. He had no issues when it came to calling his wife fat or disgusting, even in front of his children, showing hostility and depravity on towards her. Another one of Kenneth's enjoyable pastimes was sexually abusing his own daughter, Deborah. And once again, he would often do this in front of family members, including young Paul. He really was a beast of a man who didn't care about anybody else but himself. And it was that type of disgusting mentality and disgusting degenerate behaviour that would eventually and sadly rub off on Paul later in life. Father Kenneth's continued sexual abuse and depravity aimed at Deborah never showed any signs of stopping. And for young Deborah, it was a nightmare of a situation that forced her into mastering her own style of self-defence against her own father. She truly felt alone, and with no help on the horizon, she truly believed that only she could defend herself from him. And so with that, Deborah would start collecting coins, keeping them in jars, purposely emptying the jars of coins onto her bedroom floor near her door at night, just so she could hear if her father was coming into her bedroom in the early hours. And if she was awake or aware of her father's footsteps approaching her bed, she would often soil herself or wet the bed as a deterrent. She also started to pile on the weight and cut her hair to look less feminine. She hardly washed or bathed and would always wear the same clothes that stunk of urine, all in an effort to deter her father's wandering hands. Anyways, after years of this twisted abuse on towards his daughter, eventually Kenneth would be charged by the police for paedophilia and other demoralising sexual charges. And as for Paul's mother, Marilyn, well, she moved out of the shared bedroom and moved down into the house basement. She began drinking heavy and withdrew from the family, including her own children, due to poor mental health, depression and agoraphobia. Over the years, the non-stop name-calling, sexual and emotional mental abuse had left her a shell of the woman she once was, and it's sad, but it's true. And given the fact that young Paul had seen and experienced so much of this abuse, he presented himself as being a happy and well-adjusted child, despite his family's dark dysfunctional manners. Paul enjoyed maths at school and was a very articulate young boy for his age. He enjoyed camping, making friends and being around others his own age. As a child, Paul was a smart and clever lad who loved maths. His brain was like a calculator. He was literally like a little mathematician. His teachers' written reports were mostly positive and stating that he was a well-mannered young boy. And in his early teens, Paul joined the Scouts camping club as a scout leader because he was very popular with all the other young children. However, by the age of 16 years old, Paul discovered that the man who had raised him wasn't his real biological father. Back in the day, Paul's mother had an affair, a secret intimate relationship with another man who had gotten her pregnant with Paul. And so this hard-to-handle new revelation that he was the bastard child of infidelity triggered a deeper frustration and raw hatred for women deep down in his psyche. And fueled with all the abuse he had witnessed growing up from his so-called father, Paul would soon develop dark, misogynistic, satanic sexual desires, and these dark and twisted desires would eventually spiral out of control. Paul graduated from the Sir Wilfred Lauren High School at age just 17. He then started clubbing and going to bars with his friends and making elaborate and bizarre stories about himself and his life in order to trick women into sleeping with him. Bearing in mind, Paul was a young man who hadn't really had any proactive or positive life experiences within his family setting, and so essentially lying to women was Paul's way of getting what he wanted from them. It was also his way of gaining some control back over his life by dominating a woman when she's at her most vulnerable, and of course that is when she's naked. And it was around this same time, and remember, Paul was good at maths, he decided to enroll at the University of Toronto to become an accountant. And while there and now with new friends by his side, Paul would often tell his new friends about his odd and strange fantasy. Yeah, about having or owning what he called a virgin farm, a fantasy farm where he would have an endless amount of young and willing virgins, all queuing up and waiting in line to have sex with him. And only him. And I guess you could say it was from this moment onwards, Paul's much darker sexual deviancy and twisted desires became much more apparent. Yes, from 1984 to 1986, Paul began dating many women, and at first you could say they found him to be quite a kind and sweet and affectionate fellow. But his relationships would only last a couple of months or so, purely because in just a short time Paul would make it very clear to these women exactly what he was expecting from them sexually. And more often than not, this involved him hurting them, or him doing something to them that they didn't want him to do. Paul was a young man who wasn't able to enjoy any normal consensual sexual relationship. In fact, after moving from one relationship to the next, Paul started enjoying scaring and physically bullying his partners. The more timid the woman became in his company, the more he would become sexually aroused. And if they fought back or told him no, the more he enjoyed it. And then when these relationships would come to an end with these young women, he would end up threatening them by saying, "If you tell anybody what I've done to you or what we did together, I will find you and kill you." Paul's first job was working for a company called Amway, a marketing company that teaches their new employees the psychology of sales techniques. He also studied books on motivational speaking and many books on the art of chat-up artistry. But he didn't just use these skills for his new job, no. He used them to manipulate the girls he was dating. He was considered by many as a handsome fellow. He had great looks, the smile, the charm, and many convincing lies all perfectly thought out to prey upon unsuspecting and vulnerable young women. On the surface it seemed that Paul was a young, vibrant man who was brightly gifted with no emotional worries or troubles. But buried deep down in Paul's psyche was a strong repulsed hatred for women and a strong urge to fulfill his twisted desires with young girls one way or another. And it was round about now Paul's dark-rooted sexual fantasies was starting to spiral out of control. That would soon lead him to commit a series of unimaginable disturbing crimes against women. A series of evil crimes that would eventually lead to multiple murders. From this point on, the documentary does become very descriptive that some viewers may find disturbing, so viewers' discretion is advised. The year is now 1987, and it's July, and by now Paul Bernardo's sexual sadism has increased, and Paul is just 22 years old. On a dark and pitch black night, he committed his first known sexual attack on a young 21-year-old woman when she was walking home late at night. The 21-year-old was right outside her house when Paul Bernardo attacked her from behind and then dragged her to the ground, and it was over the course of 25 minutes. He repeatedly beat and hammer punched her in the face whilst vaginally and anally penetrating her. And just 2 days later, at around 1 AM in the morning, he committed a similar attack on a 19-year-old woman. Just like the other victim, she too was walking home in the early hours of the morning. She was attacked outside her own home. Paul subdued her by hitting her over the head. He then punched her to the ground and dragged her into her own back garden. He pushed a blade up against her neck and threatened to slit her throat if she made a sound. He then looped a rope around her neck and hands and then tied her to the garden fence and penetrated her whilst tightening the rope. This sicko attacked and sodomized her for over an hour. And when he was finally finished with her, he hit her on the head, rendering her unconscious. Fast forward just a couple of months and it's now the 23rd of September in the same year of 1987. Paul met a young woman named Carla Hamonka. She too was raised in an abusive and dysfunctional family. The level of abuse was nothing compared to Paul's, but her upbringing was indeed questionable at best. Carla would witness her mother being beaten up by her father, and it would be during these outbursts Carla would cuddle up with her sister in fear. During her teen years, Carla began displaying odd and strange behaviour. She became obsessed with violence and true crime stories. Carla would often talk about her own death. She would ask all her friends what they thought death felt like, which is a tad bit odd. She also had a history of hurting animals and self-harm. Now obviously teenagers can experience some of these behaviours growing up, but given what we know about Carla today, I suppose you could say these were warning signs of a much deeper psychological problem Carla had. And so instead of running away from Paul's sadistic urges like all the other girls Paul had dated and abused, Carla seemed to encourage it, becoming a naive and submissive willing participant in his increasingly violent sex games. After just months of dating, Paul was already telling Carla how to dress, how to do her hair, how to do her makeup, telling her what to do, undermining her belief and confidence and isolating her from her friends. And as time passed, Paul had turned her into his own personal slave. And even though others believed Paul and Carla looked great together, their relationship didn't stop Paul from going out late at night sexually attacking women. Paul clearly had a type. Most of his victims looked very young, with a small build. That way it was easier for him to have his own way with them. Most of the attacks followed the same pattern. He always pushed their arm up right behind their backs, followed by sodomy and vaginal intercourse, whilst at the same time pushing her head into the ground with force. Sometimes he would stick sharp foreign objects into their vagina or anus, usually sharp stones, sticks and twigs. One time he sexually assaulted a woman with a sharp knife, causing severe injury to her uterus. During these attacks he enjoyed making his victims talk and forcing them to call him daddy or captain. He really enjoyed kicking and punching his victims down to the floor, where he would punch them in the back of the head and face and stomach, fully intent on inflicting emotional, physical trauma and pain. These evil attacks on young women normally lasted anywhere from 50 minutes to 3 hours. Sometimes he would just get up and leave, so the victim believes their ordeal was over, only to return moments later and continue assaulting her. And only after he was finished he would take an item, a keepsake from the victim, something like a bank card or a driving license, or even their underwear. He truly was disgusting, a psychotic maniac serial sex offender who would be more often than not out late at night and on the prowl. In fact, over a period of just 2 years, Paul had sexually attacked 16 women. All 16 women had been sodomized and penetrated, and met with aggressive and aggravated force, and this number is only what the police already know about, when in probability, the true body count is believed to be much higher. The police believe the victim body count to be nearer 31 women in total. But no matter the body count, it didn't stop Carla from loving Paul. They both looked so happy together, both with style, flair and debonair, and visually they both looked perfect together, a real-life Ken and Barbie couple. And even though she knew what Paul was out doing to other women late at night, she simply didn't care. In fact, there was a big part of Carla that seemed to really enjoy all of Paul's evil actions. Like she was getting off on it. Her dark, sick sexual fantasies entwined with Paul's was nothing more than a recipe of utter disaster. A recipe that would soon take the lives of 3 innocent young women. Just 3 days after the third attack, the police working on this case noticed the similarities between the attacks, and they quickly realised that they were dealing with a serial rapist. Soon after, news articles were reporting these horrific crimes to the public, warning all of the women within the area to stay at home. The press dubbed the criminal as the Scarborough rapist, but outlets didn't report any clues, purely because Paul would attack these women from behind on the darkest of nights, pushing their faces into the ground, making it almost impossible for any of the victims to give the police any kind of accurate description. On the 26th of May in the year of 1990, Paul struck again. This time he attacked a 19-year-old woman behind an abandoned school, and after 60 minutes of sexual abuse and torture, he turned around and grabbed a fistful of pubic hair as a keepsake to remember her by. But in doing this, the victim was able to get a much closer look at him. She then drew a picture and gave the police a real close, accurate sketch of the Scarborough rapist. The sketch went public, and the police received 2 tip-offs, both claiming that the rapist was Paul Bernardo. One of the truth tellers worked at the local bank, and the other was Tina Smearins, the wife of one of Paul's best friends, and with that the police picked up Paul for further questioning. Now, he did admit to police officers that he did look like the character in the sketch, but here's the crazy part. Because Paul was so charming and likeable, the police decided that there was simply just no way this well-spoken young charming man could possibly be the attacker. The police simply assumed that Tina was maybe just trying to claim the reward money, and so with that they let Paul go, and they didn't send off his DNA for testing. By this point in their lives, both Carla and Paul were engaged. Carla had a part-time job in a veterinarian practice, and Paul was enjoying his life, spending time with Carla's family at their house. However, during this time, Paul had taken a serious liking to Carla's 15-year-old sister, Tammy. And so, on one evening when Paul was sleeping over, he would creep outside the family house and then peer in through her bedroom window and watch young Tammy sleeping in her bed. Carla would even help Paul out by unlocking the window catch, just so Paul could climb into Tammy's bedroom and masturbate over her bed while she sleeps. He told Carla just how much he wanted to sleep with Tammy, and unbelievably, with a touch of blagging and persuasion, Carla agreed to let him. The very next evening was a Saturday. Carla crushed up 8 sleeping pills and fed them to Tammy by mixing the powder into a gravy sauce. Pretty soon, Tammy had fallen asleep, and while she was unconscious, Paul had sex with her while Carla watched. Paul really enjoyed Tammy so much, but he still wasn't satisfied with his sexual desires towards her, and so just 5 weeks later he asked Carla if he could do it again next weekend, and of course, Carla agreed. Just a short while later, Paul had moved into the family home, living with Carla's family. Carla had told Paul that she can steal some holophene from her job at the veterinarian practice. Holophene is a super strong, powerful anesthetic. It's used to knock out animals when undergoing serious surgery. It's very dangerous when it's not administered by a qualified professional, and Carla was only a welcome support staff worker. And so, fast forward just 5 weeks, and it's now the 24th of December, Christmas Eve, in the same year of 1990. Carla's parents had gone upstairs to bed, and that's when Carla served Tammy an alcoholic beverage, heavily laced with sleeping pills. Once unconscious, the pair dragged her into the basement and set up the video camera. Paul was a huge fan of filming family events. He loved making family videos, giving a short glimpse into everyday life and Carla's family. However, Paul also loved recording a different kind of movie, and young Tammy was about to have a starring role. Once inside the basement, Carla smothered her sister's face with a cloth that was completely soaked in holophene, purely to ensure that young Tammy was 100% unconscious. Then when the camera was switched on and rolling, Paul and Carla took turns having sex with Tammy's unconscious body. During this nightmare, Paul forced Carla into sucking his sister's monthly blood from his fingers. But when Carla turned around and stated that it tastes disgusting, Paul began beating her for not showing enough enthusiasm. In the early hours of Christmas morning, Paul was sodomizing Tammy when all of a sudden Tammy started to choke on her own vomit and stopped breathing. 2 minutes later, Tammy's face turned blue with no pulse found. Paul and Carla both tried to carry out CPR, but both failed to revive her. Carla rang for an ambulance, but upon arrival, 15-year-old Tammy Homolka was pronounced dead. Now, the police did question Carla and Paul about Tammy's death, and they both told the police that Tammy had passed out from drinking and that she had clearly drunk too much and then drowned on her own vomit in her sleep. However, the odd thing is about this story, the holophane-soaked cloth had caused large chemical burns around Tammy's face, especially around her nose and mouth, but for whatever reason, again, the police failed to connect this to Paul and Carla's story of events, and Tammy's death was legally ruled as accidental. After that, Paul would get Carla to dress up in her dead sister's clothing and underwear, and then they would have sex on Tammy's bed, along with a much-loved collection of her teddy bears. One of the details I noticed while I was researching this case was, at Tammy's funeral they both placed a photograph of themselves in Tammy's open coffin. Now look quite carefully at this image. They chose to put this inside her coffin next to Tammy's lifeless body, the little girl who they both sexually violated and killed on Christmas Day. Their grins in the photograph seem to say, "Look what we did," and yeah, we think it's funny, mocking Tammy even in death. Just 6 months later, on the June in 1991, Paul and Carla were married. They both seemed happy together, and the pair moved into their own home. And as a late wedding gift to Paul, Carla brought home a young, drugged-up, unconscious body of a 15-year-old girl she had befriended years before. Her name was only referred to the public by police as Jane Doe. It's believed because of all the disgusting abuse she was exposed to. Carla had taken Jane clothes shopping before spiking her with a heavily drugged beverage. They both filmed themselves sexually abusing this girl as she lay there sleeping. The very next morning the girl woke up with no recollection of what had happened. She simply assumed that she had far too much to drink and fell asleep. But just 4 weeks later they both invited Jane Doe back over to their place, and once again Carla slipped her drink with drugs and sleeping pills. They video recorded themselves sexually abusing and raping young Jane while she was unconscious, and again the next morning Jane Doe went home and completely unaware of the horrible things they had done to her. 1 year later, on the 15th of June in the same year of 1991, 14-year-old Leslie McCarthy was making her way back home. Leslie was supposed to be back home by 11 PM. But she decided to stay out partying with her friends until the early hours of the morning, and as punishment her mother bolted the doors and locked her outside the house. Unluckily for Leslie, that same evening Paul Bernardo was out and on the prowl. He saw the child outside the house and made conversation with her. Shocked by her innocence, Paul invited her back to his car for a cigarette, and once he had her inside he put a knife up against her throat and told her not to move. He then drove the child back to his place and led her blindfolded into the front room, and it was there he made the child kneel on the ground and state her name and age whilst he recorded it on his cam recorder. He then led her into the bathroom and made her urinate whilst he filmed in between her legs. After that he led her into the spare bedroom and tied her hands to the bed headboard. He then told her to stop crying, and when she didn't respond, he punched her in the face, splitting her lip over her metal braces. That night alone, Leslie was subjected to 7 hours of multiple rapes, beatings and humiliations. She was forced to play with herself in front of the camera. He made her say how much she loved it and how he's the best she's ever had. He made her drink wine that was dosed with narcotics to make her more compliant. The next day when Carla woke up and found her husband in bed with a 14-year-old girl, she was completely upset and deeply infuriated. But not because he kidnapped and sexually assaulted a child, but because they both had been drinking from their best wine glasses. And over the next 2 days, Carla and Paul subjected Leslie to abuse and more sexual humiliations, whilst they both took turns recording it on their camcorder. At one point, captured on tape, Paul could be heard telling Leslie to stick her tongue inside Carla's anus. He told her, "Do this for me now, and I'll let you go home." By the time they'd finished with her, Leslie had suffered 2 days of sexual violence and humiliation. She was left in the fetal position on the floor, a bruised and beaten broken wreck, bleeding from every orifice. And even though young Leslie was blindfolded throughout the whole ordeal, they both knew they could never let her go, just in case she could identify them both to the police. And so in another room across the upstairs landing, a secret conversation was taking place between Carla and Paul, and it was during the conversation they both decided that they were going to have to kill her. Whilst Paul went out to fetch what he needed, Carla returned to Leslie and put a warm blanket over her. She then gave her a teddy bear to hug and told her to swallow some sleeping pills, and as Leslie fell into a deep sleep, Paul returned with a long piece of electrical cord. He then wrapped it around her neck and strangled her. It took 2 attempts before she was finally dead. They then decided to dump her body in the basement and cover it over with a duvet. Whilst Leslie McCarthy's body grows cold, Carla's parents made a surprise visit to the house. They enjoyed eating a meal together in the room just above her corpse. The following day, Paul drove down to the hardware store and bought 10 large bags of cement mix, and when he returned home they laid out on a waterproof sheet the body of Leslie Mahaffey and then cut her dead body into 8 separate parts. After that, they encased different parts of the body in large lumps of cement. Then, the following weekend, they both made a couple of trips down to Lake Gibson, located just 20 miles away from their home, and dumped the pieces of cement into the water. However, there was one large piece of cement encasing Leslie's torso and head. The weight was far too heavy for them both to carry to the lake, and so they both decided to just leave it on the water's edge, near some bushes. However, it would later be discovered by a father and son who were out enjoying a day of fishing. The third murder occurred just 1 year later on the 26th of April in the year of 1992. Paul and Carla were driving around the local schools in the area looking for a suitable victim. Sadly for 15-year-old Christine French, she was in the wrong place at the wrong time. They spotted her walking home from school, and so they parked up at the nearby church just off the roadside and waited for her to walk by. And as Christine walked closer to the church, Carla approached her holding a map, asking her for directions. And while Christine was distracted looking at the map, Paul approached her from behind and put a knife to her neck and forced her into his car. And as soon as they got back to the house, Christine's treatment was more or less the same as poor Leslie Harvey. She was doped with alcohol and tranquilizers. She was then repeatedly beaten and raped and even urinated on. She was forced to perform humiliating acts for the camera. She was sexually violated with a wine bottle and made to tell them both how much she loved it and how strong and sexy Paul Bernardo was. Unlike last time with Leslie, they didn't bother blindfolding her, purely because this time around they knew beforehand that they were going to murder her. Soon after Christine disappeared, her parents filed a missing persons report. When the police found one of Christine's shoes near the church car park, they immediately began to believe that foul play was involved. One of the sickening things Paul did was make Christine watch news reports of her father in tears pleading for a safe return. He enjoyed watching Christine cry as she watched her dad's heart break on national TV. Between the beatings and torture sessions, they would lock Christine in a cupboard. Christine would often beg to Carla to let her go home, but of course these cries just fell on deaf ears. After 3 days of torture, and with Christine on the bed, Paul mounted her from behind and wrapped an electrical cord tightly around her throat. He then leaned in closer and whispered in her ear, "So what do you know about dying?" Just moments later he then tightened the cord and Christine began to choke. He strangled her for 10 whole minutes. He actually timed her death by his own wristwatch to ensure that she was dead. On April the 30th, Christine's body was found dumped in a ditch and 15 minutes drive away from where Paul and Carla lived. The body was washed thoroughly and all her hair had been shaven off, giving the police very little to go on. Strange though, because after the third killing, Carla became convinced that her home was haunted. She claimed that she could hear voices and knockings and bangs coming from the basement. Sometimes she would claim that she could hear her name being called even when nobody else was home, when in reality it was most probably a sign of Carla's guilt and slowly unravelling any last shreds of mental stability. Paul Bernardo's mental health was also becoming increasingly unstable. He became even more abusive towards Carla. This one time he beat her so badly, he actually left her with 2 swollen black eyes. This was the last straw, however, for Carla, and so in the middle of the night she fled the house and went to stay with a family friend whose husband was a police officer, and upon seeing her injuries they took her to the hospital and the police were called in. And it was only by now, and only by this time, the police seriously started to investigate Paul Bernardo. And so just 5 months later, in the February of 1993, the police finally decided to test the DNA sample that Paul provided for them 3 years earlier. And that's when they found out that Paul Bernardo was indeed the Scarborough rapist. Upon further questioning, Carla admitted to the police everything. She got herself a damn good lawyer and agreed to fully cooperate in the investigation in return for leniency. And so, with that, Paul was arrested and the house was searched from top to bottom. It didn't take long before officers at the address found a detailed diary handwritten by Paul, describing each rape and murder he'd committed, including the disgusting rape tapes of the victims. The video images that you've been watching throughout this documentary were also found by the police. The videotapes were used in the court proceedings, leaving Paul Bernardo with a very weak defence. On April in the same year of 1993, Paul Bernardo was sentenced to life imprisonment, with the possibility of parole after serving 25 years in prison for his deep-rooted evil actions. And now get this, because I can't actually get my head around this part. Carla's defence team played the victim card. She painted herself as a complete unwilling participant in his crimes. She claimed that Paul threatened to murder her and her family if she didn't comply. However, after the tapes were played in court, it was clear to see that Carla was an enthusiastic and eager participant in the crimes. But because of her plea deal for leniency that was already made previously, and way before the videotapes were even seen or found, and because of her plea deal for leniency that had already been accepted, get this, because she was given just a 12-year prison sentence.
What the? Corn casserole.
Yep, 12 years. Anyways, in 2005 she was granted parole, and since leaving prison, she's got married again and had 3 children.
What the? Corn casserole.
Hold on, because there's more. Yep, there's more. We got more for you. We got more. Because in 2017 it was reported that Carla was working as a volunteer teacher in an elementary school.
What the? Corn casserole.
Could you actually imagine that? Finding out that you've got a dangerous, convicted speedophile and child murderer working in your child's school. Anyways, as soon as the media found out about this, a whole shitstorm was brewing, and brew it did, forcing her to quit the job shortly after she was discovered. And rightly so.
Canada's notorious schoolgirl killer. City News has learned Carla Homolka has been in the classroom and on a field trip. Dominic Fazioli tells us why the school didn't do a background check.
Last year, there was a backlash in Chateauguay, and now she's facing resistance in Montreal's NDG district.
Can I talk to you for a second?
No, you can't.
Since September, Homolka has been a regular fixture at Greaves Adventist Academy, a private Christian school.
We don't want her there. We don't want her in the school.
Lily is a concerned parent at the NDG school. She doesn't want her face shown. She says Homolka does more than just drop off and pick up her kids. She claims Homolka occasionally volunteers at the school. Several sources connected with the school say that on March 22nd, Homolka helped supervise a group of kindergarten students during a field trip to the Montreal Science Centre.
How would you feel knowing that your child is interacting with a person who's a serial killer? It's not right.
Lily says many parents have spoken to the school principal, but nothing has changed. We spoke with Homolka last week.
Carla, can I ask you a question? Do you volunteer or work at the school?
Who are you?
You know who I am.
No, I don't know who we are. Who are you?
I'm a news reporter.
Well, good for you.
By law, before anyone can have regular contact with children in Quebec schools, they are required to undergo a criminal background check. Our questions to the school about if this protocol was followed were not answered.
My lawyer will be in contact with you.
Thank you, Carla.
And as for Paul Bernardo, well, he's still living life large, having fun in prison. Oh, and he was up for parole in 2018, and it was denied because they saw him as a high-risk reoffender. In fact, he's pushed 3 times for parole. The last time and the 3rd time he attempted parole was December 2024.
Far beyond the fences of this rural Quebec prison, Paul Bernardo spent hours making the case for his supervised release. More than 30 years after he raped and murdered teenagers Kristen French and Leslie Mahaffey, their loved ones pleaded for Bernardo to be denied parole a 3rd time. By video link, Ryan Mahaffey recounted how he was only 7 when his beloved sister was stolen, his parents forever shaken by grief. Leslie's mother, Debbie Mahaffey, sat just meters from a now gray-haired Bernardo. She blasted authorities for quietly moving the designated dangerous offender last year from a maximum security prison to this medium security facility. Psychologists recently found Bernardo still displays tendencies of voyeurism and narcissistic personality disorder, and that he poses an above-average risk of sexual relapse. Still, Bernardo insisted he's never met the criteria to be considered a psychopath, and adding, people are able to repent and they should be given that opportunity. And that's what I'm asking for. Bernardo says he's enjoyed working as a prison groundskeeper and would like to go out driving and swimming and to build an intimate relationship with a woman. The parole board told Bernardo he's overestimating his skills and would pose an undue risk to the community. He's been denied parole again. There's no telling if he'll ever be released. Thomas Daigle, CBC News, Toronto.
And as with most hideous child abusers, just like 65-year-old Paul Bernardo now, he's probably receiving regular beatings, just like the kind of treatment he dished out to those innocent and helpless victims. Guys, I still can't get my head around Karla Homolka's 12-year sentence, and then she gets married and having kids. Like, guys, do you think it's fair or right? And how dare Paul Bernardo trying to push forward with his failed parole attempts? Or maybe you think he served his time. Either way, let me know your thoughts about this case in the comment section below. Hit the like button if you've enjoyed this video, and subscribe if you're new around here. And guys, please hit the bell so that way you'll never miss out on any of our new videos we post in the future. And with all that being said and done, please do look after yourself and stay safe. And I'll see you again real soon the next time, when evil follows. Later.
Corn casserole.